What's going on, everybody? It's Dan back with another Moonshine Talking. And first, let me start out by saying this emphatically and publicly. No, I don't text and drive. I'm a very safe driver. Even when I'm on the road driving, if I'm not stopped, I'm not driving and looking down and doing all that sort of stuff. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Barry, the Goat Master from that Goat Metal show, he was doing a live stream that I wasn't aware of. I was getting ready to get on the road today before I went to go see the Alien movie, and I went to click on something to listen to while I was driving, and I thought it was just a regular old video, and it turned out to be a live stream. And then he got talking about something, and while I was stopped at a light, just popped in and said, "Hey, what's going on, everybody?" Because I saw Shredbeard and Sky and a couple other people were in there. So I just said hi to Barry and a couple of the fellows, and then he started talking about like wrestling, which of course that's my wheelhouse. So he was asking a question, and I couldn't answer because I was driving, and I felt bad because I felt like I left him hanging, and I was like, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I swear I'm not ignoring you, man. I'm driving. I can't. So I stopped. I was able to stop real quick, and then I answered his question, which I'll get into in a second. I'll talk about that in a moment because it's kind of topical, pertinent to the topic at hand. And uh, and then he started, kind of engaging a little bit, and I had to tell him like I'm driving, which of course I misspelled because of my stupid fingers, and I was just trying to. So he got worried that I was like texting and driving and doing that sort of thing, which I don't. And it was funny. And then Shred call me Florida man, which is very funny. I enjoyed it. There's no, but I was telling everybody, I text Shred and I emailed Barry and I was telling him, no, I swear to God, I don't do that. I really don't. But it's just, I want to state that clearly, publicly. Yeah, I'm a good driver. I swear I am. I try not to get in accidents, particularly with my bionic neck. I don't want to like get into an accident. And next thing you know, next time I'm doing these, I'm going to be doing it with the friggin' speak and spell or whatnot. And yes, welcome. This is Dan. Welcome to another episode of Moonshine Talking. But anyhow, so for this one, that out of the way, I just want to talk about a couple more wrestling stories, some more bull crap from my time spent in wrestling. And thematically, what we're talking about here today is uh, I was gonna theme it when I almost, which kind of tied into what Barry was talking about. Um, when what he was talking about, he said that he had seen a show on Netflix called The Wrestlers, and he couldn't remember the name of it. And it was based on Ohio Valley Wrestling. Ohio Valley Wrestling is currently run by Al Snow, who's a very well renowned, well regarded pro wrestler, trainer, producer. He worked for WWE for many, many, many years. He was in ECW for he was with WWE, but at the time ECW was kind of their developmental territory, but it was kind of like an off the books, off the grid kind of thing, like an unspoken agreement between Vince and Paul Heyman, where they would use it as a feeder territory before they had a territory system where they had developmental territory. And if there was anybody there who showed promise, then they would start developing them. And it was a place to send some of their guys when they didn't really have much for them. And Al was one of those guys. They send to ECW, and he ended up doing the head gimmick. And the head gimmick got over like $1 million. He found a mannequin head in the back, he picked it up and he would start talking to it and he would act like he was crazy and like the head was listening to him, and he'd go out to the crowd, and before you know it, it caught fire in the ECW because ECW is a nuts type atmosphere. It was like Rocky Horror Picture Show, and the crowd would start bringing mannequin heads and people start chanting head, and then he brought it to WWE, and that was like the thing. It's like, what does everybody want? Head. What does everybody need? Head. What does everybody love? Head. Head. It was awesome. It was one of the greatest gimmicks ever. But Al Snow he's a phenomenal wrestler. He's a great trainer. He even when I was breaking into the business, he had a school in Ohio, in Lima, Ohio, and It was one of where the one of the people that got me into the business. She was a lady by the name of Phyllis Lee, and she used to help out both Al School and Dean School, and she gets students to them. So that was one of those things where, excuse me, I'm not dying. My throat's just a little froggy, but she would act as like a intermediary for the schools, and she would get students there and all that, and help them out, help manage and stuff like that. But that was her role. But that's kind of like the intersection of a lot of the wrestling business. So that was awesome. He even, fun fact, he cornered Dan Severn in his UFC debut. I don't know if many people know that. Al's also, he's like a legitimately tough guy, like a badass dude. And he broke into business at a time where it was not easy to get into the business. Not like today, and even more so, or I should say, not like when I was getting in, and more so nowadays, where it really doesn't take anything at all. I mean, it didn't take much when I got in. Of course they let me in, but it really nowadays doesn't take much. But they have a show on Netflix called The Wrestlers, and it follows around, documents, chronicles Al Snow's OVW, Ohio Valley Wrestling. OVW used to be the developmental territory for WWE. It took over from, they used to have one in Memphis called Power Pro Wrestling, and then eventually they would bring stuff to Connecticut, and then, like I said, the ECW. And then they decided that they needed like a proper place to go. So what they did is they found a promotion in Kentucky called Ohio Valley Wrestling, and there was a gentleman by the name of Danny Davis, who he was a regional wrestler. He was the Nightmare Danny Davis. He was in a team with another guy. They were called the Nightmares. I can't. Then his partner's name's escaping me at the moment. I'll probably think of it. I should be shot for not knowing it off the top of my head, but regardless. And then also Jim Cornette, who a lot of you'll probably know, famously, he was also an investor in Ohio Valley Wrestling. He was Danny Davis's partner, so that became a developmental place, and a lot of guys came out of there. I mean, when it was at its peak, John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Randy Orton, some lesser known names, Doug Basham, Danny Basham. I want to say the kid's name was Chris. Not Chris Kyle. That was the friggin' was the sniper dude. I was just somebody was telling me that earlier today. I forget what the kid's name was, but he was a referee and he was real good as a referee. He was also a talented performer, but I think he had some personal problems and he didn't make it as far as he could have. But there was a ton of guys that came out of there, and every once in a while they would hold these tryout camps. They would hold these weekend long tryout camps, and they would give people an opportunity for a couple of bucks. Of course, some guys I know didn't pay to get in, but you could go there and you could train. You could show them what you had, and at the end of it, they might offer you a spot in either their training program, or if you were really that good, hell, they might even offer you a contract. So I had taken a break from wrestling, took about 3 years off. I kind of like wrestling. I was burnt out after a few years being in the business, lost my mind a little bit, and decided I need a break from it. So I ended up taking way too long of a break. I wouldn't have recommended that. If I had a time machine, I'd do it a little different, but can't change the past. So one of the first things I did that was one of the first things I did is I was going to go on one of these training camps. So I got back in a little bit of ring shape and sent them sent my application in, and then they tell you, okay, you need to pay like X amount of dollars. I think at the time it was like 600 bucks to come to our training camp. And if we like you, we'll keep you around, and that'll be a deposit on if we decide that you need to train with us, then we'll take that out of the tuition fees for the training school. And the way I looked at it, because some guys look at it like a money grab, like it's just, you're being a mark to send them money to get them to have them look at you, like you're paying to have them take a look at you. I didn't really view it that way. I always looked at it like this is a business. Part of sometimes in a business, you have to do certain things like this to get noticed. Uh, you're investing in yourself, so this is what you do. Especially nowadays, and if you can pay, if you have the money to pay for it, and go to have these people who are pretty much the direct pipeline into the place you want to go to the main company and the industry that you're trying to get into, then why wouldn't you do it? It doesn't matter if there's guys there who didn't pay for it, because they're pro athletes or whatever the case is, or they're guys that are already on their radar that they're bringing in just to have a second, third, or first, maybe even first look at them. So I really think of that. So they invited me. They were like, okay, pay this. Well, welcome. I think they liked the fact that I was one of Dean's kids, and I went up to Kentucky one. I think it was after my 26th or my 27th birthday. It was my 27th. After my 27th birthday. It was in October. And went up there, flew up to Kentucky, and it was kind of cool to me because, like, when I first got into business, when I got off the plane in Tampa, when I very first got into business, I had two bags, and I got off the plane, it was raining. When I got off the plane in Kentucky, I had two bags, one of which was one of the ones I had with me the first time, and it was raining. So I thought, like, in my head, I thought this was a good sign. It was like after taking all that time off, kind of having a little bit of a bad run, it was kind of like, fortuitous, or it was, you know, whatever the case might be. I don't know. To me, it was kind of trippy. I just thought it was kind of cool and seemed like it was a good sign. Or who knows? It could have been a bad omen. So I'll get so go do the thing. We did. Long story short, we did three days of training. Cornette was there, Danny Davis was there, Rip Rogers, who was a very well-known, well-regarded journeyman wrestler who's been all over the world. He was one of the head trainers. He was the trainer of the beginners class, and he put people through the paces. There's probably roughly about 30 of us there, and at the end of the day, they had they ended up calling me back, and they invited me to take part in one of their training classes. And as it turned out, it's just the timing wasn't there. I had just signed a lease on my apartment, and I'm sure someone would say, "Well, you should have just broke it and moved to Kentucky." It's like, yeah, hindsight being 2020, that's probably what I would have done. But that was probably one of the first times where I was like, "Oh gosh, damn!" And I kind of coulda, shoulda, woulda sometimes. But so is life, so is nature things. So that was the first time when I almost. The second time when I was doing shows around here. I was doing a show in a town called Newport Richey, up in north of Tampa here in Florida, at a club, and I was doing my Moonshine McCoy gimmick. And the week I was up there, one week, had a decent sized crowd for an indie show in a bar show, and the crowd was hot for me. Like, they were doing moonshine chants and all that sort of thing because they liked me up there at that place. So fast forward the next week. Next week is we got Steve Kern in the audience, and Steve Kern, if you saw my video, 5 of my favorite opponents, that's him in the thumbnail. He's not one of my opponents. It was just the only thing I could find that was it was better than looking at my dumb face, and it kind of seemed a little clickbaity, but nonetheless, it was until I figured out how to do all this, then that's what I had to work with. But Steve was another well-known journeyman wrestler, wrestled for WWE for years. He ended up becoming a producer for them, doing backstage stuff, coordinating matches and whatnot. And then he eventually took over for Florida Championship Wrestling when they brought it back down here because they decided that they didn't want OVW anymore. They wanted to get out of Kentucky and move everything to Florida. Add this in post production because I like to make sure I'm telling things that are accurate, and so people can follow along and understand like the history. So OVW had already shut down at the time that Florida Championship Wrestling was being established here in the Tampa area. What had happened was is they had another developmental territory at the time. They had the one in Kentucky with the OVW, and then they had another one called Deep South Wrestling in Georgia. And those were kind of those like the two hubs. And if you follow enough wrestling over the decades, you know that Georgia is was the hub of WCW. So they had their developmental in the Atlanta area, and it was easier to have it there. But after a while, they start having issues with not only the owner of Deep South, which I believe was Jody Hamilton, who used to wrestle as the Assassin in the 70s and 80s, and they had some issues with uh, just a bunch of stuff going on. So they decided to shut down their affiliation with Deep South, and they brought everything to Florida. The idea being is because Florida, it's a lot easier because so many of the guys live down here, so many of the wrestlers live down here. It's a little different than say if you had everyone in Florida, then the weather's a lot better. With the exception of when it's hurricane season sometimes, if we get a major hurricane rolling through. But there's other times, like during the winter, if you were to live in, say, New York or Minneapolis, like Minnesota in that area, there's snow and stuff like that that could prevent guys from traveling, guys and girls from traveling. So having it down here, it was a little bit more. It's a more controlled environment for the company, so that's why they wanted to move everything down here. And then depending on how you talk to, some people would say, that that Johnny Ace, John Laurinaitis was in charge at the time, and he just liked the idea that there was a bunch of strip clubs and titty bars in the Tampa area. So that's why they brought everything down here. But that's just rumor and innuendo. That's just stuff I've heard over the years. But anyhow, so that is the actual. I said that they switched from OVW to FCW. That's actually not true. So I wanted to add that in there and correct the record. Uh, Hopefully you're all watching up until this point. So anyhow, let's get back to the video, and I hope you're enjoying it. All right, later. So Steve set everything up. So he was kind of like the go-to guy around here, like the point person for the developmental. So he's in the crowd. He's in the crowd. My buddy Madison, who Madison loves me. He's always like the moonshine gimmick he came up with. So he was big supporter. To this day, still is. I mean, that says something about his lack of taste, but nonetheless. Uh, but it sucked. It just sucked because there was nobody there. It was like a bomb scare because all the kids were gone. And so it was just like all the local barflies and a few people, a few of the diehards. And even though I had a fairly decent match, it wasn't great. It wasn't, and the show wasn't all that great. So it was just one of those things. It was like, oh gosh, damn. Had you been here a week before with my buddy Madison, hearing people chant my friggin' name, he might have looked around and said, "You can work with this." But so is life. So is the case. Give me 1 second. So yeah, so that's what happened there. That's another one I almost. And the next one was probably one of the worst ones. So when I was in OVW, there's a guy there by the name of Mike Bucci who used to wrestle as Nova. He was in ECW. Uh, when ECW closed, he started doing indies, and he eventually linked up with WWE. Eventually, he got to be pretty high up in the company, and he was involved in the talent relations, and he was one of the guys where if he liked you and he saw something, you could get a job. So when they move everything from Kentucky to OVW down to Florida, uh, since Addison was running Steve Kern's school, we were all kind of like always in the periphery. So we were setting up they moved us we had to move the school from the location where we had everything set up. We had to move it to this new place. And that was going to be like the first like pre FCW, but it was pretty much setting everything up for WWE. So we're all there doing all that, getting everything set up, getting the building set up, this, that, and the other thing. And Bucci shows up, Nova shows up, and he's meeting all of us, meeting all the students, some of the other guys like myself, some of the older, like journeyman indie guys from the locals and whatnot. And he's doing the obligatory shaking hands, kissing babies, that sort of thing. And he's looking at everybody. He's like, "Hey, how you doing, Mike Bucci? I'm not gonna bother learning any of your names because I'm not gonna remember them. And if I think I need to remember you, I'm gonna give you a nickname." Looks dead straight at me and goes, "Highlander." And everybody like kind of lit up because everyone's like, "Oh shit, he gave Dan a nickname. He's actually interested." At the time, they had a gimmick called the Highlanders, and they did like this Scottish gimmick. And I still had the big beard at the time, but it's come and gone a few times, but I still had the beard then, so it kind of stood out, and that's what he went with. So I'm even thinking like, oh gosh, damn, I might actually be onto something here. So fast forward a couple weeks, and there's this thing that happens called the Signature Pharmacy scandal. And what happened was is a bunch of guys in WWE, office personnel and the like, lost their jobs because they were getting supplements and other things through the mail from this doctor, who it turned out was distributing performance enhancers without a. It, it was kind of shady. And the way things are, WWE being a publicly traded company, and they had all these scandals. And if I can't remember if the dates are correct or not, it might have been around the same time or after the Benoit murders happened. But it was a real big thing that they couldn't have that stink on them. And who do you think's name is on this list? Nova. So he loses his job. And if I even had the slightest bit of an opportunity to look at me in the face somewhere along the line, that one went up in smoke. So it was like, oh gosh damn. I was telling the story the other day, and I was like, oh, I gotta share this with everybody because this is one of these unbelievable, but it is true. It did happen. I mean, it's just one of these things. It's like so fantastic. I feel like sometimes it could only happen to me. Like this was kind of like how my quote unquote career kind of went. But yeah, those are my stories of when I almost. We're hitting 20 minutes here. I don't know. I was going to talk about receipts in wrestling and a couple of other funny ribs that people have shared, but I don't want to take up anybody anymore. If I could speak any more of anybody's time. 20 minutes is long enough. I'm sure most people aren't even watching this for 20 minutes, so we'll just leave it at that. And I'll hit those up at another time. As always, stay sick, stay heavy, stay brutal. Always tuck your chin up on impact. Don't forget to breathe. Hopefully you have better work networking than I did because it was a friggin' unmitigated disasters for me. As far as video goes, I'm almost done with the Ice Star stuff, so I'm gonna be doing my album ranking pretty soon on that. I'm pretty stoked about that. I'm actually, speaking of wrestling stuff, I'm trying to set up an interview with Nasty Ronnie from Nasty Savage. I don't know how many people know his background in pro wrestling, but he has a pretty significant one. Tried to do an interview with him last month, and speaking of unmitigated disasters, that was one of them. I know he just did an interview with Vince Crowley. That was pretty cool, pretty informative. I haven't watched the whole thing, but I watched some of it. But I'm gonna try. I mean, I'll try to get him back on the channel. The last time it was kind of a disaster. I don't really want to have a repeat of that. It wasn't my fault, but that being said, I just don't want to get my hopes up too much. But that's kind of how that works. And then other than that, I got a couple things. I've been doing a collection update and some reviews coming up. And yeah, that's what's going on. So anyhow, I'm at this point doing my post video, post sign out babble. So I guess I'll just sign off with Gordon Soley. So long from the Sunshine State, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.